We've got a fantastic 3-game Thanksgiving Day NFL slate, but each matchup tells a completely different story. In this video, I'm breaking down every game, every key matchup angle, and the best picks and anytime touchdowns that I'm playing for each matchups, only what actually matters and where the biggest edges are. Let's get into it. We're going to start with game number 1, Packers at Lions. It's a 48.5-point total. Detroit is 2.5-point favorites in this one. I think what a lot of people don't realize is Detroit's offense has quietly shifted into a completely new identity. Detroit doesn't look like that same team from September, in my opinion. Over the last 2 games, they've leaned heavily into their running back, specifically Jahmyr Gibbs, who's soaked up 47 opportunities over the last 2 weeks, which is completely insane. Their wide receiver depth is a little bit shaky behind Amon-Ra and Williams. They've got injuries to Tesla, Raymond, and then Brock Wright as well. And of course, Sam Laporta at tight end done for the season. So whenever Detroit starts to fall into like neutral or negative game scripts, the offense kind of becomes a pure running back pass game. A lot of checkdowns, like these spacing routes, swing passes, these angles. It's really interesting to see what they're doing. And who could blame them, obviously, with how strong this team has been in terms of like getting it to their best players and really just Gibbs taking over last week. And they've kind of stopped pretending to be like that vertical offense. And it's not even just Gibbs. They're getting the ball into Jameson Williams' hand. They're obviously still getting Amon-Ra involved, all of that. And I think what's interesting is it's really the biggest hidden shift with Detroit is what's happened after Dan Campbell took over and started calling plays again. So they're not really airing it out. They're really just manufacturing a lot of space underneath. So Green Bay is kind of exactly what they force you to do on defense anyway. So this is kind of like the perfect opportunity for Detroit to double down on what's been working for them recently. So some of the matchup dynamics that I was looking at here, Green Bay gives up the 7th most running back catches, the 6th most running back receiving yards. Their coverage shell kind of forces everything shallow underneath, and the defense sits back a little bit. They kind of squat on those deep routes and invite anything really underneath, all those underneath throws that Detroit's already been doing. So they've been beaten all year on kind of like shallow kind of cross routes, quick game concepts, and really just the running back angle routes that Detroit's already doing in this new offensive identity. It kind of matches Green Bay's biggest weakness, if we're being completely honest. So I think the running back receiving naturally is going to spike in this matchup as well because they're going to bring a ton of pressure. And I do have some overs on Jahmyr Gibbs already. Receiving yards, receptions, and targets. I think I have all 3 across a couple of videos so far earlier this week. So we are going to see a lot of that as well. And I think if we're just looking kind of what could happen in this game, right? Detroit, they could start fast at home like they usually do, right? They've been averaging 5.6 explosive plays. That's 20 plus yards per game at home. That's the number 1 team in football. On early downs, they lead the NFL at 6.5 yards per play. So their pass attack obviously is far better indoors. Goff posts a 109 QB rating at home, and really in general has been one of the top quarterbacks in the league for years when they are kind of at home in the dome. Obviously this time of year, the weather can be a factor as well. So I think Thanksgiving, they could bring their best game in this one. A couple other things that I thought were at least interesting. We have a few strengths versus weakness collisions here. So the running back pass game, which we've talked about. Also, just I think that in general, Detroit being a little bit more banged up could just funnel more targets underneath to Gibbs. So I really like all of those. The Packers on the other side are a little bit different, right? They're one of the strangest teams in the league, in my opinion, especially on offense. They're number 1 and 3rd in long conversion rate. Almost double the league average, which is interesting, but they turn the ball over at the second lowest rate. So they're on the road. They've been scoring 2.73 points per drive. So that's the second best mark in the NFL. So they've been really good on the road this year. So their offense is also a little bit banged up. So Love's supporting cast is kind of in flux and has been for most of the season. The Packers can kind of stay alive on those impossible downs, but they struggle to create like consistent explosive plays, if that makes sense. And that really matters because Detroit's defense does allow explosiveness, especially through the air. Green Bay's ability to hit Watson or Reed downfield becomes a big swing factor in this game overall. So I think the real thing that's interesting here is we get a real clash. So we get the home offense with the explosive prevention defense. So Detroit is also a team that tries to really limit that as well. Green Bay also limits those explosive passes. So we have Detroit number 1, explosive plays at home. Green Bay, fewest explosive plays allowed at home. And Detroit is also number 3 in yards per play. So this game is all about, to me, who can win on early downs. And if Detroit stays ahead of the chains, I think this game could tilt pretty heavily in their favor. If Detroit forces a lot of third and longs, they've been kind of elite at getting off the field. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. Because Detroit is so banged up at wide receiver, their target tree is naturally like condensed a little bit as well. So fewer vertical concepts, more receiving work, all of that. But combine that with Green Bay's defensive structure, and you could get some long, methodical Detroit drives. A lot of Gibbs and Montgomery kind of dominating touches, and then Goff controlling the game from clean pockets. I think this is why Gibbs' receiving volume, Montgomery's usage in general, and the short pass efficiency all rise up pretty organically in this one. One of the things that I think is also somewhat interesting as well is Green Bay is going to have multiple chances to stay alive with these shot plays downfield, because that's kind of what Detroit has been giving up. They allow a lot of big plays. So Watson and Reed, I think, are both super interesting. I don't have either of those guys for touchdowns. I think the most likely touchdown scorer is going to be Gibbs or Jacobs. Of course, I think that St. Brown is also in the mix here. Christian Watson, Jayden Reed, those are the guys that I think could hit some big plays on their Green Bay side, because Detroit does allow those explosive passes. So you get kind of like a game where Detroit is going to be kind of driving the story, I think. Green Bay hangs around with some big third down conversions, and the running back touches quietly dominate the game flow. So Gibbs receptions, some sustained drives there. But I think the most likely narrative is that Detroit comes out hot. We get some early down efficiency, explosive pace at home, really just a running back-centric game plan by design. Green Bay bends, but doesn't necessarily break, and they sustain some long drives, third and down conversions, all of that. But Detroit controls possession through a controlled short area passing attack. I think Green Bay could respond with some big explosive plays on the other side, though. So there's a pretty methodical chess match here at play where I think Detroit could kind of dictate the matchup, but Green Bay does survive with efficiency, if that makes sense. But if your fantasy season isn't going how you hoped, this may help. I've teamed up with DraftKings Pick 6, the official daily fantasy sports partner of the NFL, to give you another way to make game day more interesting. Here's exactly how it works. You just pick more or less on 2 or more player stats, passing yards, touchdowns, things like that. Then it's basically you calling how a player performs and seeing your picks come to life on every snap. And here's the part you should know. Right now, new DraftKings customers who play $5 or more get $50 in Pick 6 credits instantly. So if you're new, you play $5 or more and they drop $50 in Pick 6 credits right into your account. All you need to do is download the DraftKings Pick 6 app and use promo code HOLKA to unlock that offer. In partnership with DraftKings Pick 6, the crown is yours. Let's get back to the games. Obviously, the first game seems relatively straightforward. I think there's a direct path for Detroit having success, but also you can make an argument for exactly what Green Bay is going to do if they have success. In this game, game number 2, Chiefs at Cowboys, I think it might be a little bit more chaotic and a little bit tougher to predict, but let's work through it here. So the Cowboys can kind of create an explosive play environment by accident just because of what their defense does. It's obviously been improved a little bit from earlier in the season, but it's kind of like the perfect defense for what KC wants to do, similar to like how Detroit wants to get the ball to running backs. That's the perfect matchup to do that again. This is the perfect matchup to get to like their best players in KC. So basically, Dallas plays zone coverage 79% of the time. That's one of the highest rates in football. This scheme kind of creates a very specific defensive profile. They allow the 4th most receiving yards to wide receivers. They've given up a league high 14 receptions of 30 plus yards as well. They almost never play man, just 14% of snaps. That's near the bottom. So what that does is it prevents easy completions, but it gives you absolute nukes when the coverage kind of busts a little bit. And KC happens to have one wide receiver who absolutely eats against these type of coverages, Rashee Rice. So we've taken Rashee Rice basically everywhere this week so far. 37% target share versus zone. He leads KC in efficiency against zone looks as well. Just had an explosive gain of 42 and 47 yards last week. So we know that the big plays are there. I like the longest catch. I like the receiving yards for Rashee Rice in this matchup, and it's one of the best matchups that he could have and exactly how they're trying to get him the ball. So I'm not worried about this hamstring that he's been battling through. He did get back in a full practice. So everything Dallas does structurally kind of creates free ways for Rashee Rice and opposing wide receiver ones in general. So KC, in my opinion, has no choice but to play hyper aggressive here. This isn't like a normal mid-season spot, in my opinion. They need to win, and they're in a situation now that they put themselves in that it's not necessarily win or go home, but it's pretty close to that at this point. So I know that Dallas actually is going to be making a push as well, but I think if the Chiefs, if they're going to have a chance to win out, when the stakes rise, Andy Reid kind of leans into Patrick Mahomes even more than normal. So KC is a top 3 in pass rate over expectation team. They ran 91 plays last week, the most by any team this season, and Mahomes is playing basically must-win urgency mode at the moment. His legs becoming an even bigger factor in important games like this, so I do have a Mahomes rushing prop out there as well this week. And when Dallas kind of heats him up, and I think they're going to be definitely trying to bring as much pressure as they can. Dallas brings a top 5 pressure rate to the table, but they also allow the 3rd most rushing yards to quarterbacks, and they force the most quarterback rush attempts in the league. So Mahomes rushing picks, I think that those are pretty solid this week. Dallas forces a lot of chaos, right? So if Mahomes can kind of escape it and kind of turn those broken plays into like those 8 to 12 yard scrambles, I think he's in a really good spot to hit his ceiling on the ground this coming week. And obviously he's been doing a lot with his legs this season overall. So it's a good spot for him to continue that. So when Dallas gets pressure without blitzing, that's kind of like been their secret, right? They bring pressure at a top 5 rate, but they generate with just 4 rushers. I've heard a lot of smart people talk about that this week, and that matters because when Mahomes is under pressure this year, he hasn't had a great completion rate overall. He's actually had a pretty high inaccurate throw rate as well. So when KC walks into a defense that can create some heat without sacrificing like that coverage integrity, that's not great. So the twist here is Mahomes has also been shredding zone coverage when he can get the ball out. 71 completion rate, 8.7 yards per attempt. And again, Rashee Rice has been going completely crazy against those protections. So Dallas can force Mahomes, or Dallas basically forces Mahomes into his preferred read already. And that's kind of where their personnel doesn't hold up. So that's why I think that Rice is positioned for a pretty explosive day here. The scheme funnels throws his way, but the KC defense creates some opportunities on the opposite side as well for Dallas that I think is somewhat interesting. So KC faces the fewest running back rush attempts in football by a mile. So we did take an under on Javonte Williams rush attempts, and it's the hardest team in the league for opponents to actually establish the run just because they're normally playing from behind, but also their run defense has been pretty elite. So this kind of destroys any script where Javonte Williams sees high volume. And I think that the 21.5 number out there is pretty high. Would not be shocked if that's bumped significantly before kickoff. But what Dallas wants to do is they play slow. They play in a bottom 5 pace. They've actually entered the game in a situation where they can try and, I mean, KC's probably going to force them into more volume from a passing perspective. We're going to get more play action, more deep shots, more middle of the field type of stuff from Dak. That's exactly kind of where KC's defenses exist as well. They've allowed 8.2 yards per attempt on the road, nearly a 70% completion rate, but they've survived by limiting touchdowns, not yards. So Dallas isn't going to be trying to grind this one out. I think they're going to be attacking downfield and through the air. And in my opinion, I think the run game is going to get completely erased here. So Dallas's offense also peaking at the right time. Since their week 9 bye, Dallas has won 2 straight, but they've also erased a 21-0 deficit against Philly. The explosive plays is really what has returned here for them. So that's something that I think could definitely continue in this one. The team looks fast again, and that matters because KC's secondary has really struggled on the road. They've given up a ton of massive chunk plays through play action, 10.5 yards per attempt allowed on play action. That's actually the worst in the league. And Dallas uses a ton of motion, misdirection. They definitely do a lot of that as well. And that's something that KC has had major issues defending on all of these. So this actually sets up really well for a Dak-driven passing attack as well. So there could be some fireworks on both sides of the ball. I definitely like this to be one of the more explosive games on Thanksgiving. And when KC can't sustain the run game, which has been a lot this year, they kind of just rely on Mahomes, and they rely on him extending plays and making plays on some of those situations. So they rely on those like explosive moments that more than just like the structured, methodical drives that you see from other offenses across the NFL. Dallas is the exact type of defense that forces that style again. So this is a game where Mahomes could definitely be doing a lot of improv out there. That's why I think the Mahomes rushing makes sense and the Rice explosive plays make sense. The running back unders are also ones that I think are really strong in this game. Both teams are kind of in a must-play perfect scenario, in my opinion. So if we're just looking at some of the touchdown scores, I do like and just some general picks. I mentioned the Rashee Rice longest catch angle. I like the unders for Javonte Williams and the Patrick Mahomes rushing stuff out there. But just in general, I think that the explosive wide receivers downfield is also a reasonable spot to attack. Most likely touchdowns, Javonte and Rice. Also think you could throw in a long shot for Hunt in there if you wanted to as well. In terms of like confidence on this game, I do have a pretty good idea that this might be the most in, I guess, the best for points and more offense, but KC is going to be throwing a ton in this one. So how it actually plays out, I think Dallas can create some explosive plays both for themselves and defensively for KC, and their zone heavy scheme leaves space everywhere when they don't get home with pressure. And KC's not going to be able to run the ball. I actually don't think that Dallas is going to try to run the ball much at all. So a lot of passing on both sides is going to lead to a lot of plays, and Dak is going to lean into play action, and a lot of those middle of the field shots, explosive plays pile up on both sides. And I think in general, we get a situation where the most explosive, chaotic environment on the entire Thanksgiving slate is in this game. Dallas is going to force some deep shots, and I think that the game is going to be decided by who can hit those big plays and who can escape pressure most effectively and who can kind of steal a drive with a broken play. Let's dive into game number 3. We have Bengals at Ravens. Obviously, this is the return of Joe Burrow, which is really exciting, but I think Baltimore can control this game, but Cincinnati might be able to control the chaos. So let's talk about what that means. I think the one thing that definitely stands out here and what this game could be defined by is one single collision. Baltimore's power run game versus Cincinnati's run defense that can't stop anyone. They've allowed the most rushing yards to quarterbacks, the second most rushing TDs, 5.1 yards per carry allowed, the worst defense in football across a lot of different metrics, not just the run game, and one of the worst that we've seen in many years across some of the top metrics also. So the 81 more points than expected allowed, which is pretty crazy. I think that Baltimore is going to be able to run the ball at will. So Derrick Henry, we have a ton of plays on him out there. I like the attempts for Derrick Henry. I like the rushing yards for Derrick Henry. I think that the most logical outcome here is that Cincinnati cannot stop him on the ground. But let's talk about a couple other things from a game environment perspective, some matchup dynamics, all of that. It is a 51.5 point total, so there's going to be some fireworks here. I think that Baltimore is a touchdown favorite for a reason, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see the Bengals make some big plays along the way also. But let's talk about Lamar Jackson, who's been kind of in a little bit of a slump since he came back from that injury. He clearly does not seem right, in my opinion. So he's taking a lot of sacks. The last 3 weeks, 57% completion rate, 6.8 yards per attempt. Basically 3 straight non-QB1 finishes. That's one of his longest droughts in years. And teams have kind of attacked him with a lot of man coverage, and he hasn't done well against that. And again, taking a lot of sacks. So Baltimore isn't really blowing teams out through Lamar right now for sure. But if there was a matchup that could cure Lamar, I think it's going to be this Bengals defense. So Cincinnati's run defense in general, though, isn't just bad. It's bad in basically every possible scenario right now. So let's talk a little bit more about how I think that the Ravens are going to attack. So the downhill power scheme, real like read option layers to it. It's not just like a strength versus weakness situation. It's like a strength versus like one of the biggest weaknesses in football. So I think that they're going to be able to continue to run it down their throat all game. But the other thing that I think is interesting is they haven't really been doing so well from a touchdown perspective. I know that they got into the end zone on the ground a couple of times last week, but overall, kind of middle of the road where they've been scoring touchdowns is actually kind of unique through the air as they've been throwing to their tight ends a lot. So Mark Andrews has a massive tight end target share in the red zone and in the end zone this year. So I like him to score. It's no secret that the Bengals are also the worst team at defending tight ends. They've allowed 13 touchdowns to tight ends this year. That's the most in the NFL by like 5 touchdowns. Tight ends score at the highest rate. They earn the highest target share more than any other position against them. So really interesting. I think the Mark Andrews touchdown pick is pretty solid. Definitely matchup aligned on Thanksgiving. If we flip things to Cincinnati, this is where it kind of gets interesting. So Baltimore, I think, can dominate, but then Burrow is going to have to make some big plays to bring them back. So Burrow has had some decent success, though, against Baltimore. He's had a game where he had over 400 yards. He's had a game in general, I think, is at 2 that were right around 400 yards. So they definitely have attacked to beat this Baltimore team without any fear whatsoever. And I think that we're going to see that a lot. Cincinnati throws more than anyone when they're trailing, and I think they're going to trail in this game as well. So even in neutral situations, Cincinnati's thrown 64% of the time. That's 4th highest in the NFL. So Cincinnati's offensive identity is built from basically playing from behind because of how bad their defense has been. So if Baltimore can stay hot, I think Burrow's volume could skyrocket here. He's probably one of the best options at quarterback on this 3-game slate. So it could lead to more deep shots. I think more YOLO balls in general down the field are good for fantasy, but it could lead to more sacks and turnovers as well, as Burrow kind of brings some chaos to any game that he trails in, especially coming back from injury. Might be a little bit rusty, but also without T. Higgins in this spot. So I think Cincinnati will be able to move the ball. I'm just a little bit concerned that they'll be able to finish drives. So we could be one of those situations where what we need to see is them scoring touchdowns, but it might be one of the things that holds them back. The Bengals defense just basically breaks physically. And then after basically they can't score touchdowns, this one, I think the 7-point touchdown spread here is interesting. It's probably pretty solid, but I could see this getting out of hand if Burrow can't take care of the football. So Baltimore's defense has like one, I think, like giant game swinging variable here, and it's Kyle Hamilton. So Kyle Hamilton, when he's been on the field, basically this defense has been pretty elite, and when he doesn't play, this defense has been very bad, actually. So if we can get him in this game, I think it changes a lot for Burrow's ceiling. And if he doesn't play, Burrow's ceiling raises dramatically. Jamar Chase also, his ceiling raises pretty dramatically as well. And I think the thing that we have to think through here from a touchdown perspective is, I think the most likely is going to be Derrick Henry for a lot of the same reasons I just mentioned. But I like Chase mostly just because I think he's going to be funneled with a ton of targets without Chase, but also Andrews because of the matchup from a touchdown perspective. So that's pretty solid. I think that the trailing script, the Joe Burrow volume should be there. But the Hamilton thing is definitely something to monitor before the game starts tomorrow. So the expected flow for me, I think that there's a chance that this game isn't a blowout, but it's not a pure grind fest either. I think it's like not a typical like AFC North fight. It's kind of one of those games where I think Baltimore can control possession, control efficiency, control the red zone, control pace, all of these things because of how bad this defense is for Cincinnati. But Cincinnati can control like the random big explosive spikes in this one. So the explosive plays, the sacks, the turnovers, the sudden bursts. I think that's what makes this game kind of volatile and also somewhat predictable. That's the full breakdown for all 3 Thanksgiving games, the matchups, the angles, the best picks. If you like this format, let me know in the comments and maybe I'll do more like this in the future. Good luck.